In this video lecture, we're going to look at the hormones, the endocrine system, many of which are controlled by the anterior pituitary and then indirectly by the hypothalamus. Now, for each hormone, pay particular attention to its function, the organ that secretes it, the organ that it acts upon, or its target organ, and then, of course, how it's regulated. For those hormones that are regulated by the anterior pituitary, their regulation was covered in the video lecture on the hypothalamic pituitary axis, so I won't be covering it in this video lecture. Then finally, of course, let's look at some of the imbalances related to the thyroid, adrenal, and pancreatic hormones. So let's start first with the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland is located in the neck, where the thyroid gland partially surrounds the trachea and located just below the larynx. The thyroid gland produces thyroid hormones, which are called thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T4 and T3 respectively, and it produces calcitonin. First, the thyroid hormones. The target organ for thyroid hormone is most cells of the body. Its function is all about raising metabolic rates, so it has a calorogenic effect. The more energy and heat generated by the effects of thyroid hormone is what we mean by this calorogenic effect. So it's going to do things to enhance energy production, heat production. Now remember, thyroid hormone is a hydrophobic hormone, that is, it can travel through the cell membrane and has receptors directly on structures within the cell. And one of those would be the mitochondria. So it can bind to mitochondria receptors and then increase the rate of ATP production in the mitochondria. It can also increase the synthesis of enzymes involved with ATP production or glycolysis, and there again making more ATP for higher metabolism, higher energy production for the cell and therefore our bodies. Now, we also need thyroid hormone for normal bone growth because it stimulates growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor, and we need it for normal nervous system development and function. And then finally, it amplifies the effects of the sympathetic nervous system because it increases the number of adrenergic receptors. Remember, adrenergic receptors are what norepinephrine binds to, so if we have more of those receptors, then norepinephrine is going to have a bigger effect on those structures, particularly the blood vessels, and then therefore amplifying the sympathetic nervous system. Thyroid hormone is regulated by the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. You'll want to look back on its regulation in the hypothalamic pituitary axis lecture. And then finally, the thyroid hormone is made using iodine. So if we don't have iodine in our diet, we can't synthesize thyroid hormone. One of the disorders of the thyroid gland is hypothyroidism or myxedema. So in other words, it's low production of thyroid hormones, and it can result in what's called a goiter. And the goiter is this swelling you can see in this woman's neck. This is because the thyroid gland itself has become enlarged, so therefore causing that swelling in the neck. What's going on here is the thyroid gland can't make thyroid hormone. Let's say, for example, you don't have any iodine in your diet, so you simply can't make thyroid hormone. Low levels of thyroid hormone, if you remember, then is going to have less inhibition on the thyroid stimulating hormone of the anterior pituitary. Less inhibition of TSH means I make more TSH. More thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, means I'm going to make more thyroid hormone. But my thyroid gland can't make the hormone. I don't have the iodine. But the thyroid stimulating hormone says, come on, make it. And it causes the thyroid gland to enlarge, to increase the amount of tissue of the thyroid gland in an attempt to convince it to make thyroid hormone. It simply can't do it, though, and so you end up with this swollen thyroid gland or a goiter. In infants, we see hypothyroidism as what's called cretinism, which, if left undetected, can result in mental retardation because, remember, thyroid hormone is in charge of helping develop the nervous system and helping in its function. The adults that have hypothyroidism show symptoms like low body temperature, muscle weakness, lethargic, unable to tolerate cold temperatures, those types of things. Remember, thyroid hormone is all about raising your metabolic rates, producing heat. So they're not producing much heat. So a lot of these things of low body temperature, weakness, lethargic, just blah feeling, and of course can't handle the cold because you're not producing heat yourself. To deal with hypothyroidism or to treat it, you can administer thyroxine, which is just a synthetic thyroid hormone, and then therefore it will act in thyroid hormone's place. The opposite of hypothyroidism would be hyperthyroidism. Now you're producing too much thyroid hormone, so you have high levels of thyroid hormone production. Symptoms, of course, then are going to be related to lots of thyroid. So you're going to have high metabolic rates, you're going to have high blood pressure, high heart rate, restless, so all excitable, insomnia, shifts in mood, all those things just kind of revving you up. A type of hyperthyroidism called Graves' disease is actually an autoimmune disease. Now, autoimmune means that the immune system is attacking itself instead of attacking foreign things, it attacks its own cells. And so when those antibodies that are made by the immune system, they actually attack the thyroid gland and get the thyroid gland to produce too much thyroid hormone, and therefore you have hyperthyroidism. Some of the symptoms that we see with Graves' disease include what's called exophthalmos, which is a bulging of the eyes due to a buildup of water-filled tissue behind the eyes. And Marty Feldman of Young Frankenstein fame, that if you've seen that movie, made a living off of those bulging eyes. The treatment is either administer anti-thyroid drugs so that basically it stops the thyroid gland from making a bunch of thyroid hormone, or either surgically remove a portion of the thyroid or treat it with radiation to destroy part of the thyroid gland. Calcitonin is another hormone of the thyroid gland. Its target is bone tissue, remember. It has a bone sparing effect. That is, it helps make the bone density greater. It does this by inhibiting osteoclasts. Now, if you remember, osteoclasts are cells that break down bone. So if it inhibits it, it stops bone from being broken down. So we build up the bone. It's also going to stimulate calcium uptake and incorporate it into the bone matrix. So it's going to remove the calcium from the blood and add it to the bone. So the bone becomes much more dense and blood calcium levels are going to become much lower. Now, there doesn't seem to be a physiological role in humans for this. So usually we only see calcitonin used therapeutically so that you can give a person a really high dose of calcitonin, and therefore it ends up having those effects that I described. Now, parathyroid gland is a gland or a set of 4 glands located on the back side of the thyroid gland. Its job is to go to bone tissue and raise blood calcium levels by stimulating osteoclasts. Now, if I stimulate an osteoclast, then I'm going to break down the bone tissue and I'm going to end up releasing that calcium back into our blood. So I'm going to raise our blood calcium levels. It's also going to enhance reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys. Again, remember, the kidneys basically filter everything out of the blood and then reabsorb the stuff back into the blood that we want. So if I help reabsorb more calcium back in the blood, I could raise calcium levels that way, and then it's going to activate vitamin D as well. Now, parathyroid gland hormones or parathyroid hormone itself is going to be regulated by calcium levels. So if my blood calcium levels go too low, parathyroid hormone is released. That stimulates the osteoclasts to release some of the calcium into circulation, and our blood calcium levels go up. Okay? The adrenal gland, as we've talked about it before, is located above the kidneys. That's why it's also referred to as the supra, above, renal, referring to kidneys gland. It's actually 2 glands in one. We've got the adrenal medulla, which we've talked about before when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. That's the one that produces the catecholamines, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine. But this time they are hormones. The adrenal cortex is the surrounding the adrenal medulla, and it's in charge of producing the corticosteroids, including the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. The mineralocorticoids include aldosterone, and they're in charge of regulating electrolytes in the extracellular fluid, whereas the glucocorticoids include cortisol, and they're in charge of increasing glucose synthesis and glycogen formation. So we'll look at each one of these in turn. First, the mineralocorticoids that are aldosterone. The mineralocorticoids include, the target organ for the mineralocorticoids is mostly the kidney. It functions to reduce excretion of sodium from the body. So the idea is that the kidney will end up reabsorbing more sodium, so that is, this more sodium is returned to the blood, and because more sodium is returned to the blood, the water is going to follow. So I want you to develop this mantra for this class, and that is, where sodium goes, water follows. So anytime you move sodium somewhere, water is going to follow right behind it. So if I reabsorb more sodium, that means I'm going to end up reabsorbing more water as well, so my blood volume gets bigger. Now that comes at a cost, and that cost is going to be for eliminating potassium. If I reabsorb lots more sodium, I end up losing potassium at the same time. They just can't both go the same direction. Regulation is due to elevated levels of potassium. Maybe I have too much potassium in my blood, so I need to get rid of some of that. So I'll secrete aldosterone. That way I reabsorb the sodium but get rid of the potassium, and the potassium becomes part of my urine. Under stressful situations, high levels of the ACTH, which usually stimulates the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, but if it's really high levels of ACTH, it may cause more aldosterone. Now, if I get more aldosterone, that means I reabsorb more water. If I get more water reabsorbed, that means my blood volume is going to go up, and that's going to increase blood pressure. And so there's a tie-in there of why under stressful situations your blood pressure goes up. There's a lot of other things going on with stress too, which we'll come to later. Now there's also a cardiovascular related effect or control of the release of aldosterone, and I put this in brown because I don't want you to worry about it now. This is kind of a sneak preview of what's to come. That is, when we get to the cardiovascular system, we'll talk about the renin-angiotensin mechanism and the effects of atrial natriuretic peptide hormone on the release of aldosterone, which in turn then affects blood pressure. So again, just a preview. Don't worry about it now. We'll come back to that later, and you'll be responsible for knowing those mechanisms when we do the cardiovascular system. Now, the glucocorticoids include cortisol, but also include some other things like hydrocortisone, cortisone, corticosterone. Those are all considered glucocorticoids, but it's only cortisol that's secreted in significant amounts in humans, so that's the one we'll concentrate on here. Now, the target organ for cortisol is most cells of the body. Its function is for help in energy metabolism because it keeps blood glucose levels constant, and it helps maintain blood pressure by acting as a vasoconstrictor. So lots of different things going on there. The ones I want you to pay attention to particularly is the things about under stress. That is, under stress we have a high levels of cortisol produced. And so under stressful situations, say, now we have to worry our stressful situations might be this first test coming up in a couple weeks. But it might also be, if you think back in primitive times, our hunter-gatherer society, it may be that there are a lot of wolves howling in the outside of your camp. So you're worried about that. So you want to get prepared for things. So you want a lot of glucose in circulation, so you have gluconeogenesis. We want to build up glucose levels. So remember, gluconeogenesis is going to be basically taking glucose or making new forms of glucose. So we're going to take fats and proteins and then convert those into glucose. So it has a glucose sparing effect. That is, it saves the glucose for our brain, for our muscles, building that glucose levels up so we can use it more effectively. It also has an anti-inflammatory or anti-immune effect because we really don't want to put our energies into that if we're worried about the wolves that are about to eat us. So we could take advantage of that. Now you might use a cortisone cream. That's basically cortisol. So it has an anti-inflammatory effect. That means you put it on a rash on your arm, let's say, and that's going to help reduce the inflammation we have associated with that rash. Now its regulation is through ACTH and CRH. We saw that in the last video, but basically high levels of CRH from the hypothalamus means high ACTH, which means high levels of cortisol. And cortisol is supposed to have an inhibitory effect on CRH or ACTH. But under stress, the central nervous system overrides that inhibition of cortisol. So it ignores this red line here, and so CRH is made in abundance, so is ACTH, so is cortisol. No negative feedback to reduce CRH levels. That stays high, meaning we have more ACTH, more cortisol, because we want the high levels to deal with the stressful situation. One of the effects or one of the disorders related to cortisol levels is Cushing's syndrome, or sometimes you'll hear it called Cushing's disease. This is high levels of cortisol, so our hypercortisol levels. It can be due to too much ACTH being released, so that is maybe you have an anterior pituitary tumor that's producing way too much ACTH. If we have high levels of ACTH, that means you have high levels of cortisol. It can also be because of clinical administration of large doses of glucocorticoids, so like prednisone that's used to reduce the immune response. Say if you have an autoimmune disease, you take prednisone so that your immune system's lowered so it doesn't attack your cells anymore. But those doses may be too high, and there can lead to high levels of cortisol. Symptoms that we see with this is going to include steroid diabetes. That is, the idea it's cortisol that's raising blood glucose levels or causing hyperglycemia, not lack of insulin that's relating to hyperglycemia. Also, loss of muscle and bone protein. Remember, we're taking those proteins and fats and converting them into glucose. We're also going to have high water and salt retention. This is particularly when it's under extreme stress, we get aldosterone released, and that aldosterone is going to end up causing the hypertension and then this edema or swelling in the belly. Also get water tissues or buildup of water fluids in certain tissues, and they end up with a moon face, that is this rounded face, and then a buffalo hump, this hump on the back here. And of course you can end up with poor wound healing because you don't have the inflammatory response for healing wounds, and you end up with muscle weakness or spontaneous fractures because you're pulling the protein out of the muscle and bone. So what you end up with is having a person and a look kind of like what I want to say looks like Humpty Dumpty. That is, they have spindly little arms and legs because of all the wasting of the muscle and bone, yet their trunk is rounded because of all the fluid build up, and their face is round because of that moon face appearance. Okay? Treatment is, of course, remove the tumor. If there's a tumor in the anterior pituitary that's producing too much ACTH, let's get rid of the tumor. Or if it's due to too much or high doses of glucocorticoid drugs, let's get rid of the drug. The opposite of hypercortisolism would be hyposecretion, but this in Addison's disease, it could be hyposecretion of both adrenal cortex hormones, cortisol, as well as aldosterone. So symptoms then related to this are going to be things like weight loss, hypoglycemia, because you don't have the cortisol, you're not going to raise your blood glucose levels, you're actually going to be a little on the low side. Low sodium levels in the plasma because you don't have the aldosterone to help reabsorb the sodium, and high potassium levels because the potassium is not being eliminated. You get dehydration because if you're not reabsorbing the sodium, that sodium ends up staying in the kidneys and becomes part of the urine, and so therefore, remember, where sodium goes, water follows. The water stays there in the kidneys, and so you end up producing a high volume of urine that would make you dehydrated and would lower your blood volume, thereby lowering blood pressure, so you're hypotensive. And then last, dizziness and fatigue, particularly because you're hypoglycemic. Treatment in this case is corticosteroid replacement therapy. That is simply replace the cortisol. And in some cases, if aldosterone is low as well, then you have to replace the aldosterone. Now, JFK had Addison's disease most of his life and had to deal with it even through his presidency. Another gland of the endocrine system is the pineal gland. This produces the hormone melatonin. It's tied with our diurnal cycle. It peaks at night, it's lowest at noon, so it helps us fall asleep. It's influenced also by the amount of light due to its connection with the visual pathway, so you can screw with somebody's ability to fall asleep if you expose them to a great deal of light at night, and they simply will not produce melatonin, and therefore they can't fall asleep very easily. It also may have an anti-gonadotropic effect in children. Now, if you think of that word, anti-gonadotropic, it's against the gonads, and tropic, remember, is regulating hormone or releasing hormone, so it stops the testes or ovaries from releasing estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone. And this is the idea, or why you would have this, is to inhibit sexual maturity if those hormones are being produced too early in life. The last thing is the hypothalamus has a high number of melatonin receptors. Remember, the hypothalamus is in charge of a biological clock, so the melatonin can bind those receptors and influence that clock so you can sleep. You actually can take melatonin as an herbal remedy if you have trouble sleeping at night. Instead of taking sleeping pills, this is a safer way to try to enhance sleep. The pancreas is another gland that has endocrine functioning in it, but it also has an exocrine function to it. There are pancreatic Acini cells within the pancreas which are in charge of producing the digestive enzyme. So we'll talk about that when we do the digestive system. The endocrine function we'll look at is to do with the pancreatic islet cells of the pancreas, or they used to be called the islets of Langerhans. These cells are in charge of producing insulin and glucagon, so the alpha cells within those islets of Langerhans, so the pancreatic islet cells, produce glucagon, the beta cells produce insulin. Now, insulin has a target organ of most cells of the body. The idea of insulin is to lower your blood glucose levels because it enhances the transport of glucose into body cells. It also inhibits the breakdown of glycogen. If you don't break down glycogen, that means you're not going to have glucose made and put into the blood. It inhibits gluconeogenesis, remember that conversion of proteins and fats into glucose. And it triggers enzymes in cells to convert the glucose to fat. This is particularly important in adipose tissue and tied with those carbohydrate-rich meals. So if you look over here, let's say you decide to eat a big carbohydrate-rich meal. So you're eating pastas, lots of rice, potatoes, lots of wheat products like breads. That ends up raising blood glucose levels. Then, therefore, the beta cells of the pancreas respond by producing insulin. The insulin's job then is to get the cells to take up the glucose at most of your body cells, and it gets the liver to store the glucose as glycogen and thereby lowering blood glucose levels. Okay? So if you don't eat the high-rich meals here, you're not going to have this spike in glucose, and you won't have a spike in insulin, resulting in all that glucose going into your fat cells. Now the fat, once it gets hold of the glucose, it's going to convert that glucose right to fat. And that's the last thing you want. You don't want all this glucose you just ate converted instantly to fat and be added to your adipose tissue. Glucagon has the opposite effect of insulin. That is, it raises blood glucose levels. It works by acting on the liver, causing glycogenolysis. That is, glyco refers to glycogen. Lysis means to break it down, so it's going to break the glycogen down into glucose, thereby producing more glucose, putting it into circulation. It also promotes gluconeogenesis, again, that conversion of fats and proteins into glucose, and enhances the release of glucose to the blood. So if, for example, your blood glucose levels fall after maybe skipping a meal, those alpha cells of the pancreas will release glucagon in response to that low blood sugar levels, and the glucagon then gets the liver to convert the glycogen into glucose and do the gluconeogenesis or enhanced glucose release so that the blood glucose levels rise back to normal. Diabetes mellitus is a condition in which we have high blood glucose levels, so we're hyperglycemic. There are two types of diabetes, type 1 or type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes usually has an onset of before the age of 15. This used to be called child onset diabetes, although that term's not being used anymore. It's an autoimmune disease in the sense that the immune system basically attacks the pancreas and destroys the beta cells. The beta cells then can't make the insulin, so you can't get the insulin in circulation to lower your blood glucose levels, therefore you end up being hyperglycemic. So the idea of what glucose does here, or excuse me, what insulin does here, is that insulin is supposed to bind to these insulin receptors, and in turn that helps in other cell membrane transporters to bring in sugar. So if we don't have the insulin here, these transporters can't bring in all that glucose, so glucose accumulates in the blood. So therefore the person with type 1 diabetes needs to take daily injections of insulin so that that insulin can act on these receptors and enhance the ability of the cell to take in glucose. Type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes because typically only older adults or obese individuals got it, but now since children, obese children, end up with type 2 diabetes, they no longer call it that. Here, the cells become desensitized to the insulin. That is, they don't care. Oh, I don't give a crud if there's insulin on these receptors. I'm done. I don't want to take up any more sugar. Again, this is often associated with obesity. There is some genetic predisposition for individuals so diabetes, type 2 diabetes may run in the family. Diabetes has lots of different symptoms. Primarily, the one you think of is hyperglycemia, too much sugar in your blood. This also things you see is lipidemia and high blood cholesterol levels, and this can end up leading to lots of vascular complications, including atherosclerosis, strokes, heart attacks, renal shutdown, and blindness. The loss of sensation that individuals feel is due to nerve damage. So people who have diabetes, you go to the doctor's office, you'll see the sign. If you have diabetes, take your shoes and socks off. The first thing they lose is that loss of sensation is in their feet, and they can end up having sores on their feet and not even realize it because they don't have any pain associated with those sores. In fact, a friend of mine, her father-in-law lost his foot because he was diabetic and didn't pay attention to his feet. The sore became ulcerated and then gangrenous, and they actually literally had to cut his leg off below the knee to save him. Other things you see with diabetes is polyuria or excessive urination because your kidneys can't reabsorb all the sugar that's in your blood, and so the sugar remains in the urine, and because of the osmolarity associated with that, then the water stays with that sugar and you end up peeing too much. Polydipsia, because since you're urinating so much, you're dehydrated, so you end up being thirsty. Polyphagia is excess hunger associated with it because your cells aren't getting the sugar they need because they can't get it in, primarily with insulin diabetes or type 1 diabetes, and so you're always hungry, yet you're always thin because your cells aren't taking the insulin, or the sugar up. Metabolically, when we look at diabetes, what's going on again is think about it as either hypoinsulinism, that is, you don't have the insulin, so you can't take the sugar into the cells, okay, because you don't have the insulin to enhance the ability of that sugar to go in the cells. Therefore, you end up being hyperglycemic. That is high levels of sugar in your blood. Now, what's going on inside the cells then, if they're not getting sugar, then they're going to break down fatty acids. because there's no sugar, you got to decrease glycolysis and glycogenesis, and so you're going to end up using fatty acids or even proteins as an energy source. When you use fatty acids as an energy source, you end up with ketone bodies. Those ketone bodies cause what's called ketosis. Ketosis is ketoacidosis is the buildup of acids then, or metabolic acids associated with these ketones. That also leads to what's called acetonuria, or acetone or ketones in your urine, and again, acidosis. If your blood becomes too acidic, then that can lead to coma and even death. And then, of course, the hyperglycemia up here leads to a lot of glucose in the urine, which means you pee a lot, you're dehydrated, and you're thirsty. So that ends our lecture on the different hormones associated with the endocrine gland. Again, make sure you look at and get used to the idea of what those hormones are doing and the functioning of that, and we'll be reinforcing a lot of that in class.